Hi everyone, Matt here from Proof Fly Fishing. Welcome back. In today's video we're going to install a winding check. We're going to finish up talking about guide spacing, talk a little bit about alignment, how to get your guides to all line up, and then we're going to finish up with the basics of how to wrap a guide. So the first thing is a winding check. I'll put a picture in the lower corner of what one looks like, but it's basically a washer. They come in different styles. This one has a little bit of knurling on it, a little bit of machine work. And what its function is simply to close up any gaps that might be at the front of your grip. So if you're opening your grip up and you get a little too aggressive and you have kind of a gap there, a winding check is a decorative piece that will cover that area up. So you get a nice transition from blank to grip. Now you don't want these too tight. If there's a little bit of play in that winding check, that's just fine. We don't want it to pinch the blank. You'll notice that especially when casting, you can damage the blank. Now to install a winding check, I just use super glue. I use a very tiny amount right at the base of the blank, and once that's on, simply slip that winding check into place and just rest that lower section up against like a wall or something until that dries, and you should be all set. Later on when we install a hook keeper, I'll show you a little bit about kind of how to make sure that that's sealed up really well so that we don't get any water underneath the grip later on. On the guide spacing, in our last video we installed the tip top, and if you recall we measured our first guide down from the top of the blank, not the top of the tip top. So we have our first placement right here, and it's a good idea to just go ahead and using like a silicone free guide tape to just lay out all the guides on your blank. That way you'll have a sense of where everything is as you go, and it'll kind of speed up the process of wrapping. Now, a couple things you might encounter when you're laying out the guides. First thing is dealing with the ferrules. In this case, we have a spigot ferrule, and it's going to leave a small gap. I've got about 1/8 of an inch gap here between the tip section and the mid section. So when you're laying out your guides and you come to a ferrule, go ahead and assemble your blank and then measure right over top of that ferrule. So I want to account for that 1/8 of an inch spacing there. Now over time that gap might get smaller as you assemble and disassemble your blank. Nothing to worry about. It's going to be such a minute amount of difference in the guide placement that you'll never notice it. So keep wrapping, keep spacing out your guides. If you get to a guide and it comes right to the end of the ferrule, so the guide sits basically right on top of that ferrule, that's perfectly fine. What we're going to do when we talk about ferrule wraps, probably in the next video, is how to incorporate the ferrule wrap into that guide wrap. So we're just going to have one maybe slightly longer guide wrap if that's where the placement falls. If you have any other questions about guide placement, just shoot me an email and we can kind of address those as needed. So alignment. Alignment can take a little bit of time, and depending on how particular you are, it can involve some rewrapping, but hopefully not too much. So what we're going to do, I'm going to go ahead and tape a guide on, and it's going to be a little hard to see, so try to follow with me here. So I use a little piece of tape, guide tape, and I've got my measurement marked out on this blank. It's right here, and I want this guide to be centered over top of that measurement. In a minute I'm going to do a close-up. I'm going to switch cameras and you'll be able to see up close what this looks like, how these guides are wrapped on and how I'm proceeding. But basically this guide is now centered over that tape. Now what I want to do is rotate that guide. We want to try to eyeball it as close as possible to the tip top. And the reason we installed the tip top first is because now it's our guide for aligning all of the guides on this section. So what I like to do is get it as close as I can, and then I'll hold it up kind of like I'm looking through the scope of a rifle, close one eye, look through the guide that's closest to me. In this case, it's the first one. And I want to line that up with the tip top. Now, if it's off ever so slightly, you'll be able to tell as you kind of move that blank up and down and maybe left to right just a little bit, and you'll see it, whether it's in alignment or out. And then you can just make small adjustments. This one needs to go to the right just a little bit. And now it's dead on. Once we get our placement as close as we can, it's okay to take another piece of tape and put it on the other guide foot. And again, I'll show you that in a close-up in just a minute. But that's how we're going to go about aligning guides. So our first guide aligned just with the tip top. When we install our second and third guide, the same thing. We're going to eyeball it as close as we can when we're just taping it on initially. And then you hold that blank up and you move it up and down and you look through the guide that's closest to you, line it up with the guide in front of it and that one and one in front of that one all the way to the tip top. And that's how we're going to proceed. Now, we're not going to wrap with so much tension that there's no way to adjust these guides. One thing that's important is we want to wrap with enough pressure to make sure we get a good solid guide on, but we don't want it so tight that we can't move that guide just a little bit in order to get perfect alignment later on. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly go over kind of the big setup as far as using a rod wrapping jig and tensioning devices, and then we're going to switch to a close-up so you can actually see how we wrap a guide, the knot we use to tie the thread on, how we proceed, and then how we tie that off. So we've got our rod wrapping jig, and what we want to do is, if our guide is going to be, and say we're going to wrap one right in the center here, we want this blank balanced. We don't want it wobbly or tippy on one end or the other. So if this is where our guide is going right here, I want to roughly center that on my jig. If it were off center, it would be tipping on you like that. And sometimes when you get to the end of a blank, that's exactly what will happen. And so that's why we use this outrigger. It's just an extra support that we use to keep that blank stable as we're wrapping. And when we get to ferrule wraps at the very end, it gets a little bit different, but we'll go over that in the next video. So get your guide. Now, if you're using if you're starting on the tip top, you'll probably want to start with that outrigger in place. And again, center that guide between the two uprights. And this is where you don't want too much space between the uprights. You want enough so you can get your hands in there so you can wrap, but you don't want them so far apart that you're getting a tremendous amount of flex in that soft tip. It's just going to make wrapping that guide and kind of getting your thread started a little more difficult. So keep them close together, but far apart enough that your hands are in there without too much trouble. So to hold our thread, we're just going to use a coffee cup. Thread, we're using nylon this time. This is size A. Pretty much for any fly rod you're going to make, size A is going to be your standard thread. And we'll do silk in another video, talk about that, the similarities and differences. But so take your thread, just throw it in your cup like that. Then we've got our book. It goes between our cup and our rod wrapping jig. Go ahead and open it up. This is about, a third to a halfway through. And center that thread in the book, just like that. So it's running out of the cup about a third of the way through this book and coming over top of the blank. Once you have that set up, then we're going to switch now to a close-up video to kind of show you the mechanics of how this is all going to work. Okay, we're back. I have our first snake guide secured to the blank. And you'll notice a couple things. One, I'm using 2 pieces of guide placement tape. And when you're just starting wrapping guides, it's kind of nice to use 2 pieces. It really holds that guide secure, and there's very little chance of it slipping around on you. The second thing I want to point out is that the tape is located very close to where the guide starts to lift off the blank. And what that does is expose the toe of the guide. That's where we're going to start wrapping the guide, and we want to have the tape far enough away from there that we can get our guide started without the tape getting in the way. So let's go ahead and start this wrap. A couple things to have on hand. You don't have to use one. I always have a burnisher on hand. It's always in my hand when I'm wrapping. And then you'll also want to have a double-edged razor blade or a fly tying scissors handy. So we've got two parts of the thread here. One part is this part, and it's coming off right off the book. And we're going to call that the tensioned thread. And then we've got the tag end of the thread, which is kind of the loose end of the thread that we're going to be attaching to the blank. So go ahead and pull your thread out your book, have it come over top of your blank, and then go ahead and just kind of pinch that with your thumb on the blank there, just like that. Now you want a good 4 to 5 inches of thread past where the blank is. You want a nice long piece, and I'm going to show you what we're going to do with that in a little bit. But now to attach the thread, what we're going to do, come over top of the blank, then you reach around the blank and pull that tag end up. And where it crosses the tensioned thread, right where those two meet, I want you to take the tensioned thread and push it over top of the tag end. So we're trapping the tag end underneath the tension thread. And then put your thumb on the back again to hold it. And then we're going to do it again. We're going to reach under the blank, pull that tag end up until it meets the tensioned thread, and then just push that tension thread again over top of the tag end to secure it. Now it's going to take 2, sometimes 3 of those lock wraps to get that thread nicely attached. And once you have it, you can just kind of pack those threads a little bit. Again, this is where the burnisher comes in handy. Some people use their fingernails too, so whatever you're comfortable with. And we're going to do just a couple wraps now, just to get that guide wrap started. You can kind of pack and adjust with that burnishing tool as you go. After 4 or 5 wraps, you'll notice that this tag end starts to get in the way. So we're just going to go ahead and cut that off. So rotate your blank until that's pointing up, just like that. And then just kind of hold it perpendicular to the blank, or put a little bit of tension on it. Take your razor blade and rest it right on that guide wrap, and then with a little sawing action, just cut it right off. Now don't throw this piece away. Keep it handy, keep it real close, because we're going to use that to finish our wrap. Now one thing you'll notice as I go around, you'll start to see right where that little tag end is. You can kind of see it right there. That's where I cut the thread. There's a little bump there. Don't worry about it, just wrap right over top of it. Get as close to it as you can. And with 2 or 3 wraps, it'll completely disappear. Now, one thing, when you're just starting off, it's easy to overlap the thread. So a little trick you can do, you can lead the thread. What I do is create an intentional gap when I'm wrapping, and then as I go, I'm kind of pushing that thread tight. And once you get a little more practiced, what you can do, I'll take this tape off in a minute. So we've got our guide tape. We're getting close to our guide tape. So now you want to take that off. It's easy. It's easier if you can leave a little tag end on that, kind of a little loose piece, so that when you get to it, it's very easy to remove with one hand. So you just go ahead, grab it, carefully peel it off, not moving your guide, and you keep wrapping. When you get a little more practice, you don't have to kind of create that intentional space and then pack it in every single time. You can kind of move your blank around and just wrap that thread on nice and tight. It's also good after 4 or 5 wraps just to pack that thread, because even if you can't see the space between it, you can't see the blank showing through, sometimes it'll show up when you go to apply a finish to that thread. So we're just going to keep wrapping here, and again we're going to stop periodically and just pack that thread, make sure that it's all nice and tight. Don't want any gaps. You can see how much that thread is compressing for me. And now when we're getting real close, we're getting to be about 5 to 7 wraps away from where that guide starts to lift off the blank. So we're going to stop, and we're going to take that tag in that we cut off, that 4 or 5 inch piece, and we're going to fold it in half, and then we're going to create a small loop with it, just like that. And we're going to take that loop and we're going to insert it under our tensioned thread, pointing toward the opposite end of the guide. And we're just going to lift it under our thread and let it sit there, and we're going to wrap over top of it. Now you'll see it as it comes around. There it is right there. And then we've got the loose ends just coming off, hanging on the other side. So keep wrapping. You're going to wrap right over top of that loop and get to the point where you're just behind where that guide starts to lift off the blank, and then do a little packing. Again, make sure everything's good and tight. Then I want you to stop your thread right at the base of where that loop comes in. Now take your thumb and hold it against the wrap. Keep everything nice and tight. Then take your razor blade and cut off the tensioned thread. Give yourself a couple inches at least to make it easier to handle. And then you're going to take that tension thread, the end of it, and you're going to slip it through that loop. Just like that, and pull it tight. Now when you put some downward pressure on that, you can let go with your thumb, and then you grab those 2 loose ends of the loop and start to pull them. And when you pull them, what's going to happen is that loop's going to close. Now you can't even see the loop, but I've still got my tag end that I just cut hanging here. Keep pulling, and that tag end will get pulled underneath those wraps you did, and will tie itself off. And before you cut that end piece off, go ahead and give your wrap a final pack. Make sure that it's nice and square on the edges. Sometimes when you wrap, it can get a little angled on the blank. So just kind of using the tip of the burnisher, or again your fingernail, straighten that wrap up and make sure it's nice and tight. And when you're happy with the way it looks, again, grab your razor blade, and just like before, we're going to hold this piece perpendicular to the blank with a little bit of tension, rest our blade on that wrap, and just saw it off. So that's what we're left with. A nice tight wrap that's nice and even on the sides. Then all you have to do is take your blank, flip it over, and you can take the tape off at this point if you want. That first wrap is going to hold that guide nice and secure for you, and you can just wrap the other side. That's pretty much it for today. Next time we're going to talk about how to wrap a ferrule, wrapping the stripping guide. We might get to the hook keeper as well, but take some time and practice. Wrap a guide, cut it off, see what you like, see what you did wrong, practice packing it. Make sure you get it nice and square. Chances are the tip section is going to be the most challenging just because it's small and flexible, but it's okay to kind of hold the blank and apply a little pressure in the opposite direction of the thread to keep it from bending too much on you. But it takes a little bit of practice, and so go ahead and, if you can, get all the guides wrapped except the stripping guide, and we'll get to that next time. I think that's it for today. All right, thank you.